At 4:37 in the morning on March 14, 1945, Private First Class Eduardo Reyes crouched in a drainage ditch 700 meters from the Japanese bunker complex on Hill 457, watching the pre-dawn mist rise off the Zambales mountains. He'd wrapped 15 sharpened bamboo stakes with strips torn from his undershirt, each stake exactly 43 centimeters long, each tip fire-hardened to the color of tobacco and coated with a paste he'd spent 3 nights preparing. His hands smelled like crushed seeds, and his fingers were stained dark green. The American lieutenant had told him 2 days earlier that if he tried this, he'd face a court-martial for violating the rules of warfare. Reyes had nodded respectfully and waited for the officer to leave. What Private Reyes was about to attempt had been dismissed by every American advisor in the Philippine Commonwealth Forces as primitive, ineffective, and potentially criminal. The bamboo bagakay, the traditional spike trap his grandfather had used against wild boar in Pampanga, had no place in modern warfare, according to the tactical manuals distributed by MacArthur's headquarters. Certainly not when coated with the sap of the ligas tree, which his grandmother had warned him never to touch with bare skin. The weapon was a joke, they said, a relic, something for the history books, not the battlefield. But Hill 457 had already killed 19 Filipino soldiers in 6 days. Reyes knew because he'd helped carry out 14 of the bodies himself, including Corporal Benigno Santos, who talked about his daughter's 6th birthday party the morning before a Japanese machine gun opened his chest. The bunker complex was a fortress of interconnected positions, each one covering the others, all of them invisible until you were close enough to die. American artillery had pounded the hillside for 2 days without effect. The Japanese simply retreated into their tunnels and emerged when the shelling stopped. Reyes understood something the American advisors didn't. The problem wasn't firepower, it was patience. The Japanese positions were strong, but their patrols were predictable, following the same paths down the hillside every night to collect water from the stream below. He'd watched them for 11 nights, marking their routes with small stones. They moved in single file. They trusted the darkness. And they never expected a weapon that sat silent in the earth, waiting. The boar hunter's son. Eduardo Reyes learned to set spike traps when he was 9 years old, following his grandfather through the cogon grass outside their village in Pampanga province. The old man moved slowly, his calloused hands selecting bamboo stalks with the same care a jeweler might examine diamonds. "Not too thick," he'd say, running his thumb along the grain. "Not too thin. The bamboo must bend before it breaks, so the boar drives the spike deeper with its own weight." They'd spent entire afternoons preparing the stakes, shaving them to points with a bolo knife, hardening the tips in fire until they rang like metal when tapped against stone. His grandfather taught him to read animal paths, the way other children read books. A broken stem here, a depression in the mud there, the subtle architecture of how creatures moved through landscape when they thought no one was watching. "A trap is a question you ask the earth," the old man said, "and the earth answers only if you listen." By 14, Reyes could set a bagakay pit in under an hour, camouflaging it so perfectly that he sometimes lost track of his own traps. He learned which leaves to weave across the opening, which mud to pack around the edges, how to make disturbed earth look undisturbed. More importantly, he learned patience. A good trap required understanding behavior patterns, where animals felt safe, where they moved without thinking, how routine bred carelessness. When the war came to the Philippines in 1941, Reyes joined the Commonwealth forces with those same calloused hands and the same fundamental understanding that the most effective weapons weren't always the loudest. American officers handed him an M1 rifle and told him to forget everything about jungle warfare. Modern combat, they explained, was about firepower and frontal assault. His grandfather's methods belonged to a different century. Reyes carried the rifle and said nothing, but he'd noticed that American doctrine didn't seem to account for an enemy who'd spent 3 years learning every ridge and ravine in these mountains. The hill that ate soldiers. Hill 457 killed Sergeant Domingo Cruz on March 8, 1945 at 2:15 in the afternoon. Cruz was leading a squad up the eastern approach when machine gun fire erupted from a bunker no one had spotted. The rounds caught him across the stomach, and he died in the tall grass, calling for his mother, while the rest of the squad crawled backwards through the mud. Private Alfonso Mendoza dragged Cruz's body back after dark, crying the entire time. The next morning, Captain Thomas Brennan ordered another assault, this time with mortar support. The mortars hit nothing but earth. The bunkers were too well concealed, reinforced with logs and 3 feet of packed soil. Private First Class Ramon Villanueva reached within 50 meters of the nearest position before a grenade killed him instantly. Corporal Jesus Flores made it even closer, close enough to throw his own grenade before a sniper shot him through the throat. His younger brother Miguel, fighting in the same platoon, had to be physically restrained from running up the hill after him. By March 10th, the casualty count stood at 11 dead, 14 wounded. Captain Brennan brought in American artillery, 105 mm howitzers that shook the valley with their reports. The shells churned the hillside into a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. When the barrage lifted, the Filipino scouts advanced again. The Japanese emerged from their tunnels and cut them down with the same methodical precision. Corporal Benigno Santos died that afternoon, along with Privates Enrique Baltazar and Tomas Aquino. Santos had shown Reyes photographs of his daughter just that morning, a little girl in a white dress, missing her front teeth. Reyes watched the bodies come back wrapped in ponchos and began to do the mathematics. 19 men dead in 6 days. At that rate, the entire company would be gone before they took the hill. The Japanese weren't even using sophisticated tactics. They were simply waiting in positions that couldn't be flanked, couldn't be suppressed by artillery, and couldn't be approached without crossing open ground. The American solution was to keep attacking, to overwhelm the positions with aggression and courage. But courage, Reyes noted, didn't stop bullets. On March 11th, he approached Captain Brennan with a different idea. "That's not how we fight this war." Reyes found Captain Brennan in the command tent, studying topographic maps under a kerosene lamp. He waited until the officer looked up, then explained his plan in careful English. He would set spike traps along the Japanese patrol routes, the paths they used to access water, to rotate sentries, to move between bunker positions under cover of darkness. Not dozens of traps, just 5 or 6, positioned with precision. The Japanese moved in patterns. Patterns could be exploited. Brennan listened with his arms crossed. When Reyes finished, the captain shook his head. "Private, we don't booby-trap the battlefield. There are rules about weapons designed to cause unnecessary suffering. The Hague Conventions, the Geneva Conventions. You understand? We're not savages." "The Japanese use mines," Reyes said. "Mines are different. They're manufactured weapons, not bamboo sticks smeared with God knows what." Brennan leaned forward. "What exactly were you planning to put on these stakes?" Reyes hesitated. "Liga sap, from the tree. It causes poison." "You're talking about poison weapons." Brennan's voice went cold. "That's explicitly prohibited, Private. If you deploy poison traps and the Japanese discover them, they'll use it as propaganda. They'll claim we're using chemical warfare. Do you understand the diplomatic shitstorm that would create?" "Sir, the hill has killed 19 of our men, and we'll take it with proper tactics. Infantry assault, supported by artillery. I'm not authorizing war crimes because you're impatient." Brennan returned to his maps. "You try this, Reyes, and I'll have you court-martialed." "Dismissed." Reyes saluted and left the tent. He'd expected the answer, had known that American officers wouldn't approve anything that didn't appear in their field manuals. But he'd also noticed that Brennan hadn't posted guards on the supply depot, hadn't assigned anyone to monitor what the Filipino scouts did during the night. The Americans had rules, yes, but they also had a hill they couldn't take and bodies piling up daily. Sometimes, Reyes thought, rules were luxuries afforded to people who weren't dying. Preparation in the dark. Reyes began on the night of March 12th, moving through the drainage ditches with the same methodical care his grandfather had taught him. He'd already cut the bamboo stakes days earlier, each one 43 centimeters long and sharpened to a needle point. The length was specific, long enough to penetrate deep into a boot and calf, short enough to conceal completely beneath a thin layer of earth and leaves. He worked in total darkness, feeling his way along the Japanese patrol route he'd memorized, 700 meters from the bunker complex. Where the path descended toward the stream, the ground was soft from recent rain. Perfect. He dug the first pit with his hands, exactly 30 centimeters deep and 40 centimeters across. Not big enough to be obvious, just large enough to catch a foot. The bamboo stakes went in point up, angled slightly toward the direction of travel, so a boot would slide directly onto them. 5 stakes per pit, arranged in a circle. He'd fire-hardened each tip the night before, heating them over coals until they turned dark and rigid as iron. The hardening process made them strong enough to punch through boot leather without splintering. Then came the ligas paste. He'd prepared it carefully, mixing the tree sap with crushed seeds from the buta-buta plant and water from a stagnant pond. The mixture had the consistency of thin honey and smelled faintly sweet, which made it more dangerous. Nothing about it warned you to stay away. His grandmother had told him stories about hunters who died from accidentally cutting themselves while handling ligas-coated arrows. The sap didn't kill quickly. It caused deep infections, fever, delirium. It was, in every legal and moral sense, a poison weapon. Reyes coated each stake with a thin layer of paste, using a strip of cloth wrapped around a stick to avoid contact with his skin. His hands shook slightly, not from fear of being caught, but from awareness of what he was creating. These weren't just traps. They were designed to cause maximum suffering to whoever triggered them. He thought of Santos, chest opened by machine gun fire. Villanueva, killed by a grenade. Cruz, bleeding out in the grass. Then he kept working. The camouflage required another hour per pit. He wove fresh grass across the opening, packed mud around the edges, scattered leaves and twigs to match the surrounding terrain. When he finished, even he couldn't spot the trap from a meter away. He set 5 more over the next 2 nights, each one positioned on a different section of the patrol route. By March 14th, every path the Japanese used was threaded with invisible questions waiting for answers. The scream at dawn. At 6:23 on the morning of March 15th, the first trap answered. Reyes was in his foxhole, 200 meters downslope, when he heard the scream. It wasn't the sharp cry of someone hit by gunfire. It was prolonged, rising in pitch, the sound of someone who'd looked down and seen bamboo stakes punched through their boot and into their calf. The screaming continued for almost a minute before cutting off abruptly. By 7 o'clock, the pattern became clear. 3 separate traps had been triggered. The Japanese were pulling their wounded back toward the bunker complex, but the extraction was chaotic. Reyes could hear shouting in Japanese, the sounds of men arguing. Through his field glasses, he watched them abandon one patrol route entirely, clustering on a different path, which led them directly to the 4th trap. The mathematics shifted immediately. The Japanese had been rotating 8-man patrols every 6 hours, moving with confidence through terrain they controlled. Now their patrols shrank to 4 men, moving slowly, testing every step. Their attention shifted from watching for attackers to watching the ground. Response times from bunker positions slowed. The defensive perimeter, which had been tight and coordinated, developed gaps as soldiers focused on not becoming the next casualty. Captain Brennan ordered an immediate reconnaissance. Lieutenant James Morrison led a scout team up the eastern approach, the same route that had killed Cruz and Villanueva. They reached the Japanese forward position without drawing fire. Morrison signaled back. The bunker was abandoned. The Japanese had pulled everyone back to the central complex, consolidating their forces. By noon, Filipino scouts had advanced to within 200 meters of the main bunker line. By 1500 hours, they'd flanked 2 positions and taken them with grenades and rifle fire. The Japanese, fixated on the invisible threat beneath their feet and short on manpower due to casualties, couldn't maintain their overlapping fields of fire. The fortress collapsed inward, section by section. Hill 457 fell at 1732 on March 15, 1945. Total casualties for the final assault: 1 Filipino soldier wounded, shot through the shoulder but expected to recover. The Japanese lost 23 men killed and 11 captured. In the abandoned bunkers, American medics found 3 Japanese soldiers in advanced stages of infection, delirious with fever, their legs swollen to twice normal size. Reyes walked up the hill after the fighting ended and kicked dirt over the remaining traps before anyone could examine them too closely. Questions without answers. Captain Brennan arrived at the captured bunker complex 2 hours after the hill fell, accompanied by Lieutenant Morrison and a medical officer named Captain Peter Walsh. Walsh examined the Japanese wounded with increasing concern, noting the infected puncture wounds, the fever, the distinctive circular pattern of the injuries. "These aren't mine wounds," Walsh said. "Mine's fragment. These are penetration injuries. Something punched straight through." He looked at Morrison. "Did your men use bayonets during the assault?" We took the positions with grenades and rifle fire. No close combat. Brennan called for Reyes, who approached and saluted. Private, you were part of the reconnaissance team. Did you see any unusual Japanese defensive positions? Anything that might explain these injuries? No, sir. Just the bunkers. The wounded soldiers have puncture wounds in their legs and feet. Multiple wounds, all infected. You have any theories? Reyes kept his expression neutral. Could have been debris from the artillery barrage, sir. Shrapnel, pieces of bamboo blown into the air. Hard to say. Walsh frowned. These wounds are too clean for shrapnel, too uniform, and the infection pattern is unusual, almost like the wounds were contaminated deliberately. The three American officers exchanged glances. Brennan studied Reyes carefully. Private, when I explicitly forbade you from using bamboo traps, did you understand that was a direct order? Yes, sir. And you're telling me you saw nothing on the hillside that resembled traps of any kind? I saw a lot of disturbed earth from the shelling, sir. Holes, debris. The Japanese moved through that terrain for weeks. If someone had set traps, the Japanese would have triggered them long before yesterday. It was a good answer because it was technically true. The Japanese had moved through that terrain for weeks without incident, right up until the moment they didn't. Brennan held Reyes's gaze for a long moment. Finally, he said, "The results speak for themselves. We took the hill with minimal casualties. I'm not going to second-guess success." He turned to Walsh. "Log the Japanese wounds as combat-related injuries. Cause uncertain. Could have been anything in that chaos. Artillery debris, improvised defenses we haven't found yet. No need to speculate." Walsh started to object, then caught Brennan's expression and closed his mouth. "Yes, sir." Reyes saluted and returned to his unit. The conversation ended there, filed away under the category of battlefield mysteries that didn't require solutions. The Americans had their hill. The method used to take it remained officially unexamined. The quiet adoption. Word spread through the Filipino scout companies within 48 hours. Not through official channels. There were no memoranda, no tactical updates, but through the informal networks soldiers always develop. Private First Class Eduardo Reyes had done something on Hill 457. The exact details were unclear, but the results were undeniable. 19 casualties over 6 days, then a final assault that cost 1 wounded. By March 20th, Corporal Miguel Flores, younger brother of Jesus, who died on the hillside, approached Reyes in the mess tent. "Show me how you did it," he said quietly. "Whatever you did." Reyes looked around to ensure no American officers were present, then nodded. That night, he walked Flores through the process. How to select bamboo, how to sharpen and harden the stakes, how to identify patrol routes by studying patterns of movement. He didn't mention the Ligas paste. That detail seemed too specific, too easily traced. But the basic concept, concealed stakes positioned on predictable paths, that could be taught. Flores implemented the technique during an assault on a Japanese supply depot outside Baguio on March 27. The results mirrored Hill 457. Japanese patrols disrupted, defensive positions abandoned, the target taken with minimal Filipino casualties. 2 other scouts, Sergeants Antonio Reyes, no relation, and Pablo Cruz, witnessed the success and adapted the method for their own units. By mid-April, bamboo spike traps had appeared along Japanese supply routes throughout the Zambales mountains. Not in massive numbers, the method required too much preparation for widespread deployment, but strategically, targeting choke points and patrol paths. Japanese after-action reports, captured later, referenced unknown ground-based obstacles, causing morale difficulties and movement restrictions. The effect was psychological as much as tactical. Japanese patrols, already exhausted and undersupplied, began treating every path as potentially lethal. Movement slowed, defensive perimeters contracted. The invisible threat beneath their feet proved more debilitating than artillery or rifle fire because it couldn't be spotted, couldn't be suppressed, couldn't be defended against except through paralysis. American intelligence noted the shift in Japanese behavior but attributed it to declining morale and supply shortages. The actual mechanism, bamboo and patience, remained beneath official notice, spread only through the quiet conversations of Filipino soldiers who understood that sometimes the best weapons were the ones nobody acknowledged, the unofficial endorsement. On April 23, 1945, Colonel David Martinez of the Philippine Commonwealth Army summoned Reyes to his command post. Martinez was Filipino by birth, American by education, a West Point graduate who'd spent 3 years fighting a guerrilla war in the mountains. He understood both doctrine and deviation. Private Reyes, I've been hearing stories about Hill 457. Conflicting stories. Martinez leaned back in his chair. Captain Brennan tells me you took the hill with a textbook infantry assault. But I've also heard from Sergeant Cruz and Corporal Flores that you employed unconventional methods. Care to clarify? Reyes chose his words carefully. Sir, I used what I knew would work. The Americans have their manuals. I have my grandfather's lessons. Sometimes those things align. And when they don't align? Then I exercise judgment, sir. Martinez smiled slightly. Diplomatic answer. Here's my problem, Private. Your methods work. I've seen the casualty reports. We're taking positions that should cost us 20-30 men, and we're losing 1 or 2. That's not luck. That's technique. But your techniques also violate about 6 different conventions on warfare, and if I officially endorse them, I'll have every American general from here to Manila climbing down my throat. Then don't officially endorse them, sir. Exactly. Martinez stood and walked to the window. I'm authorizing you to conduct training sessions for scout platoons. Unofficial sessions during off-duty hours. You'll teach terrain analysis, movement prediction, camouflage techniques, very general topics. If those lessons happen to include information about how your grandfather hunted boar, well, that's just cultural context. And if American officers ask what I'm teaching, tell them you're sharing indigenous knowledge about jungle survival, which is true, just not complete. Martinez turned back to Reyes. I can't promote you. I can't commend you officially. But I can make sure your knowledge doesn't die with you. Fair enough. More than fair, sir. Reyes conducted 7 training sessions over the next month, teaching groups of 15 to 20 scouts. He focused on observation and patience, how to identify patterns, how to predict movement, how to turn an enemy's routines into vulnerabilities. The specific applications were left to the students' imagination. By June 1945, when the war in the Philippines effectively ended, the technique had spread to at least 12 different scout companies, implemented in dozens of small actions that never made it into official reports. The cumulative impact was impossible to measure precisely, but Colonel Martinez's staff estimated that casualty rates in units employing the method dropped by approximately 60% compared to units using conventional tactics. The Japanese, for their part, never determined exactly what they were fighting against. Their own reports described morale collapse and movement paralysis, attributing it to supply shortages and American artillery superiority. Nobody mentioned bamboo. After the silence, Eduardo Reyes returned to Pampanga in August 1945 with a combat infantryman badge and no other decorations. He'd been promised a promotion to corporal twice, both times delayed by administrative issues that never quite resolved. The official records of Hill 457 credited the victory to superior infantry tactics and effective use of artillery support. His name didn't appear. He worked as a carpenter for 37 years, building houses in the same province where his grandfather had taught him to set boar traps. Occasionally, other veterans would stop by his workshop, men who'd fought in the scout companies, and they'd talk about the mountains, about patrols that went smoothly because someone had remembered the lessons about patience and observation, about hills taken without the expected casualties. They never used the word trap directly. They'd just nod and say, "Your grandfather's methods worked." In 1983, a military historian researching unconventional tactics in the Pacific War contacted Reyes for an interview. The historian had found Japanese documents describing organized ground-based obstacles in the Zambales mountains and wanted to know if Reyes had any information. Reyes, 70 years old by then, considered the question carefully. "We used what we had," he said finally. Bamboo, mud, knowledge of the terrain. The Americans had their artillery. We had our grandfathers. Both worked. The historian pressed for details, but Reyes deflected. Some techniques, he suggested, were better left in the past. Not because they were ineffective, he was clear about that, but because modern warfare had moved beyond them. The historian published a paper in 1985 titled Indigenous Combat Methods in the Philippine Liberation, which mentioned spike traps in passing but provided no tactical details. The paper was read by approximately 200 people, mostly academics, and generated no particular controversy. The Philippine Army officially adopted bamboo stake obstacles as a recognized defensive technique in 1992, almost 50 years after Reyes first used them on Hill 457. The field manual entry described them as traditional area denial devices with historical applications in jungle warfare. The manual credited the technique to guerrilla forces operating in the Luzon Highlands, 1942 to 1945, making no mention of specific individuals. By that point, Reyes had been dead for 4 years. His grandson, Michael Reyes, served in the Philippine Army from 1995 to 2003 and learned about bamboo stake traps during basic training. When he mentioned to his instructor that his grandfather might have used similar methods during World War II, the instructor shrugged. "Maybe," the man said. "A lot of veterans contributed techniques that made it into the manuals eventually. Usually nobody remembers who thought of it first." The lesson, Michael thought later, was about innovation and credit. His grandfather had solved a problem that was killing his friends, using knowledge that came from hunting boar in the grass. The solution worked. It spread. It saved lives. And 60 years later, it was just another paragraph in a field manual, attributed to no one, belonging to everyone, which was probably how his grandfather would have wanted it. Eduardo Reyes had never fought for recognition. He'd fought to stop watching his friends die on hillsides that could have been taken with patience instead of courage. The fact that his method outlived his name wasn't a failure, it was the entire point.